Western civilization is often described as a temple built upon a single, solid Greek foundation. We're taught that the architects of democracy, philosophy, and logic were a distinct, almost isolated population, the primordial Europeans who emerged from the Aegean to light the torch of the West. But if you look at the genetic code of a modern Greek, the story of the cradle of civilization begins to dissolve into a much more complex Mediterranean-wide web. The data suggests that the Greeks are not an isolated European exception, but rather a biological bridge that defies our modern continental borders. To understand the Greek genome is to understand that European is a geographic label, not a genetic one. While we often group the Greeks with the inhabitants of Berlin, Paris, or London, their DNA tells a story of deep ancestral continuity with the Levant, the Caucasus, and the Anatolian highlands. For millennia, the Aegean was not a barrier between continents, but a central nervous system connecting three of them. The DNA reveals that the people who built the Parthenon were more closely related to the farmers of modern-day Turkey and the Levant than they were to the hunter-gatherers then roaming the forests of northern Europe. The map of humanity wasn't written in a lab, it was carved by the sea and the stone. This is Helix Horizon, where we trace the code that refuses to stay still. The myth of the pure Hellenic line was largely a 19th century invention, a byproduct of European Romanticism that sought to claim Greece as the white, Western ancestor of the Enlightenment. In reality, the Aegean has always been a site of radical genetic convergence. It began at the end of the last ice age, when the Balkan Peninsula served as a refuge for humanity. As the climate warmed, these early hunter-gatherers didn't just expand north, they met a transformative force from the east. Around 7000 BC, the first Anatolian farmers crossed the Aegean, bringing not just grain and livestock, but a genetic signature that would become the dominant bedrock of the Greek population. In northern and central Europe, these early farmers often replaced the indigenous hunter-gatherers in massive demographic turnovers. But in Greece, the evidence points to a more layered integration. The Minoan civilization on Crete, the first high civilization of Europe, was built by people who were genetically almost indistinguishable from the Neolithic farmers of western Anatolia. They were a Mediterranean people, shaped by the sun and the soil of the Near East. Around 2500 BC, a new signal arrived, the Yamnaya. These were the horsemen from the steppes of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, bringing Indo-European languages and the Bronze Age technology that would eventually define the Mycenaean Greeks. In Central Europe, the Yamnaya impact was a total genetic replacement. In the Aegean, however, the steppe signature arrived as a subtle infusion, not a tidal wave. The existing Mediterranean core absorbed the newcomers, adopting their language and their war chariots, but keeping its biological continuity intact. But this discovery revealed a hidden cost to our classical assumptions. If the Greeks were a hybrid of Anatolian farmers and steppe warriors, then the very concept of a European identity starts to look like a cultural mask worn over a much older Near Eastern biological reality. The Mycenaean world, the age of Homeric heroes and bronze-clad kings, is often portrayed as the sudden arrival of true Greeks. Yet, when geneticists sequence the remains from royal tombs at Mycenae or the palatial complexes of Tiryns, they find a population that is roughly 75% identical to the Minoans who preceded them. The difference was a small but significant shift, a roughly 15% infusion of DNA from the steppes and another minor contribution from the Caucasus. The Greeks did not arrive in Greece, they were brewed there over centuries through a process of selective absorption. This continuity challenges the popular myth of the Dorian invasion, the supposed catastrophic replacement of the Bronze Age Greeks by iron-wielding northerners. The genetic evidence shows no such rupture. While the political structures of the Mycenaeans collapsed around 1200 BC, the biological lineage of the people in the valleys and on the islands remained remarkably stable. The Dark Age of Greece was a cultural reset, not a demographic one. The people who eventually built the classical city-states of Athens and Sparta were the direct descendants of the people who had survived the collapse of the palaces. What scientists expected next never appeared. Given the proximity of Greece to the expanding empires of the East and South, you might assume that the classical period and the subsequent Roman and Byzantine eras would have diluted this Aegean core beyond recognition. However, the genetic signal of the ancient Greek remains the dominant signature in the modern population. Whether in the Peloponnese or the islands of the Dodecanese, the DNA reveals a persistence that survived the rise and fall of Rome, the Slavic migrations of the 7th century, and the centuries of Ottoman rule. This regional stability is a case study in how geography dictates genetic destiny. The fragmented landscape of Greece, deep valleys separated by high mountains, and thousands of isolated islands created a series of genetic refuges. While continental Europe was a highway for massive population movements, the Aegean was a labyrinth. Change was filtered, not forced. Even the Slavic migrations, which significantly altered the demographics of the Balkans, left a varied impact on Greece. The genetic Slavic signal is visible in the north, but fades as one moves toward the coast and the islands, where the ancient Mediterranean core remains nearly untouched.
But this is where the story stops being about them and begins to challenge our definition of Western. If the Greek genome is fundamentally a Mediterranean-Anatolian hybrid that has remained stable for 4,000 years, then the line we draw between Europe and the East is an imaginary one. The genetics prove that the people who gave the West its intellectual vocabulary were biologically part of a continuum that includes the Levant and Anatolia. The Aegean was not a wall, it was a mirror. Identity, in the Greek context, was never about biological isolation. It was about the polis, the city-state, and the shared cultural language of the Mediterranean. The Greeks recognized themselves not by a pure European bloodline, but by their participation in a specific way of life that was networked across 3 continents. This reveals a universal human pattern. We use culture to create boundaries where biology refuses to acknowledge them. The preservation of this genetic core brings us to one of the most provocative findings in modern paleogenomics, the ghost of the South. When we compare the DNA of modern Greeks to that of other European populations, we see a distinct divergence. While much of Northern and Western Europe is defined by a massive late Bronze Age shift toward the steppe-derived R1b and R1a haplogroups, Greece, and by extension much of southern Italy, retains an overwhelming frequency of Neolithic and Bronze Age Mediterranean lineages. This is particularly evident in the Magna Graecia effect. Genetic studies of southern Italy and Sicily reveal that the Greek colonization of the 8th century BC was not just a cultural export, it was a massive demographic movement. The inhabitants of these regions today are often genetically closer to modern Greeks than they are to northern Italians. This biological bridge survived the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Arab conquests, and the Norman invasions. It suggests that once a population reaches a certain density in a specific ecological niche, like the Mediterranean coast, it becomes incredibly difficult to displace. But this discovery revealed a hidden cost to our modern geopolitical categories. If the Greek signal is so deeply rooted in a pre-European Mediterranean Anatolian substrate, it forces us to ask, what does it actually mean to be European? If the very founders of Western thought were genetically a Near Eastern population that settled on the Balkan fringe, then Europe is not a biological reality. It is an idea, a successful brand that has spent 2 centuries trying to distance itself from its own Oriental origins. The genetics of Greece act as a signal that cuts through the myth of the continent. It shows that the Aegean was the original threshold, a place where the innovations of the East were distilled and reconfigured into something the world now calls Western. This wasn't the result of a pure, isolated genius, but the result of being a crossroads. The Greeks were the ultimate design for human adaptation. They took the genetic and cultural building blocks of the Levant and Anatolia and used the geography of the Aegean to filter them into a new identity. And this is where the story stops being about history and starts being about the future of identity. We live in an era where people use DNA tests to find purity or belonging to a specific flag. But the Greeks teach us that the most influential populations in history are those that are the most hybridized. Purity is a biological dead end. Continuity is found in the ability to integrate. The shadow of the ancient world is not found in the white marble of the ruins, but in the persistent, resilient code of a people who have lived at the edge of three worlds for 9,000 years. They are not a relic of the past. They are a case study in how a population survives the deep time of empires. But as we look closer at this Mediterranean network, we realize that the Greeks were not the only ones bridging the gap. To the west, another civilization was rising, one that would take the Greek blueprint and turn it into a global machine. But their genetic origins tell an even jarringer story of migration and memory. If the Greeks were the bridge, who were the architects of the empire that followed, and what did their DNA reveal about the true cost of becoming Rome?